Hello everyone, and I am back with a new tutorial, and this is the hibiscus flower that we will be painting for this month. This is a beautiful hibiscus that grows in my garden, and I absolutely love it. So what I did was I used some masking fluid and I just swapped the flower around so you can paint it the other way around or upside down. But the masking fluid is all over the little sections where the slugs ate some of my flower or some of the leaves. They ruined some of the flowers. However, I thought this turned out quite nice, with the little bits that are eaten out. And the pink was just so beautiful. And what I did was, so in this case, I used a very old brush, which is a very old watercolor brush. I don't use it often, but you can see the little hairs are standing all very weirdly. So I eventually decided to find a new brush to add the masking fluid. But I also found that a dotting tool, which you will see me use later, is a much better option. So here's where I ditched this brush because it's really horrible. I just find that, it's, I don't know, it's, you need a brush with a small tip. So this one wasn't the best idea. So I just quickly look and find another one. But I do think the dotting tool might be a better option for you, or if you have something with a sharp point, that is better because your masking fluid is like a glue and you can remove it from any plastic object or any glass object for that matter. So I opted for another smaller brush, but do make sure that you wash your brushes when you're done because it will ruin some of the brushes. Like I said, it's like a type of a glue, like a rubber substance, and I just find that the dotting tool worked better for me in the end. I think that's what I'm going to use in the future. So for this tutorial you will need some masking fluid, you will need 2 glasses of water, you will need tissue paper, and you will obviously need all the colors that I mentioned on the color chart, and the paper was the Fabriano Artistico hot press watercolor paper. I do think as a beginner you will be able to paint this. And I say that because most of my patrons are beginners. So if you take your time and you just, start painting one petal at a time, you will see that you'll be able to paint it. I do want you to take a chance and paint it. So I also have 2 glasses of water, but I just rinsed my brush with the masking fluid in the glass of water, and I'm going to clean the water because that has a substance, so you can't necessarily use that while painting. It will affect your paint. It is like a glue rubber type of substance, so rather rinse your water out. And like I said, use the old brush. These are some of the colors that I will be using. This is the quinacridone red that I used, and it was on the palette from the previous tutorial. I don't want to waste the paint, so I'm going to just use some of the color that is in there. I'm going to wait for the masking fluid to dry completely before I paint right now, and you'll see if you put it on too thick you will lift up some of the masking fluid. Now there are other brands that you can use. I bought this brand at our local little art store, and it is a full bottle, so it's quite a big bottle, but I do know that Daniel Smith and Sminky has the same masking fluid type that has like a little nozzle that's very easy to use. So if you prefer to buy that or use that, that's perfectly fine. I just don't want to waste this, so I'm going to finish this bottle. And I just noticed that I missed a few little sections, so I'm going to add it in there, and then I just borrow some of the thicker parts that I dropped in there. I want to use a thin consistency because it will lift up and you will remove it if you paint over it. And I'm going to put a whole layer over this whole piece of paper with a very watery wash of pink. So I just want to make sure that I use it very thin and sparingly. I just want to make sure that it's dry completely before I paint. So it's a little bit wet. I'm going to just wait a second. And of course we have load shedding, so you will see that when the light is on it's a little bit brighter, and when it's dark we have load shedding. So I open the curtain, but then, or the blinds, and then it's a little bit bright too, because sometimes when the sun shines on my table, which is right next to the window, it might be too bright, so you can see the sun peeping through there a little bit, but it gives you a migraine when I open it completely. So this is the watery wash that I'm going to paint all over this flower. So I'm just going to start right here, put it all over. Certain sections will be a little bit lighter than others, but I'm just going to go ahead and drop it in everywhere. So use a big brush, any brush will do. This is the silver velvet brush, and it's the number 8. And what you want here is you want to use a brush that has quite a nice, that holds quite a lot of water, because you want to put this water down, or the paint down, very quickly with quick washes, so that it doesn't dry and create hard lines. I don't mind the hard lines because you can still remove them with your brush, but preferably you want to use a brush that can hold quite a lot of water. I do apologize for the sneaky sun through the blinds there. I'm trying to close it all the time and move the blind, but it still peeks through. It's a little bit of a beautiful autumn sun while we paint. So again, the very, very watery mix of this quinacridone red from Winsor & Newton. There's another brand, the Sennelier brand is a very good brand as well for the quinacridone red. I haven't tried any of the other brands. I don't know if there's another quinacridone red from another brand, but this is these are the two that I know of and that I have, that I've tested, that are very good. And I just carry on dropping in this very watery mix all over this section. And I don't have to worry, that's why I painted the masking fluid on the page where all of those little white sections are. This way you don't have to worry and go around each section very carefully, because you might just paint into certain white parts. So the masking fluid sometimes is a nice option to use. And this is the consistency of watercolor that you want on your paper, and the watery mix that you want. So just want to be careful around this section, because it might be part of the leaf, because we're also going to paint in one of the leaves. So I just want to make sure that I'm not painting over one of the green parts, and it won't be a train smash, but preferably we don't want to paint a leaf pink. So now we are going to rub out some of the pencil markings, just a few that might be a little bit too dark, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. I just want to slightly soften some of them, because now with the outline that I just painted, you'll be able to see the watercolor painting. And so just a few little softer markings. Now sometimes you will not be able to remove pencil markings with your eraser or your putty eraser, because the minute you paint over it, especially if it's a staining watercolor, you won't be able to remove it. I'm just checking some parts are still a little bit wet. I'm just going to wait for it to dry completely, and then we're going to start with our layering of our painting. So let's mix the colors so long while we wait for the painting to dry completely. This is the Winsor & Newton Opera Rose. It's quite a bright pink. There's another pink from Sminky that's also, I think it's Opera. It's even brighter than this pink. I've used it before. And then we're going to use the quinacridone red from Winsor & Newton. And like I said, there's one from Sennelier as well. I'm not sure about the other brands. We're also going to use this beautiful Rose Madder Lake from Sennelier. Now, I only bought a few tubes of Sennelier paint, because when I initially started painting, I bought quite a lot of Winsor & Newton and some of the core watercolors. Then I topped up with a few of the Sennelier watercolors as well, and it's quite lovely paint to use. And what we're going to use as well is this, obviously the Winsor & Newton quinacridone red, and then I might use a little bit of blue, like like a French ultramarine or ultramarine blue, and maybe some magenta at a later stage, but that we'll discuss as we paint. For now, let's focus on these little colors that we have right here in front of us. Yes, I'm just cleaning my brush in the water, which is out of the view, and let me see, I think I'm going to use the Raphael little brush. So this is the Rose Madder Lake from Sennelier. I want to use basically all the colors, but this is the color, and that's basically what it looked like on paper. As you can see, it's a beautiful color. And the Opera Rose from Winsor & Newton, as you can see, a bright pink. And then the Quinacridone Red from Winsor & Newton. So similar colors, but slight differences in all of the tonal values. So we're going to mix them all on the plate, and you're going to see that I mix between all of the colors. Wherever I want to add a little bit more of the bright pink, the opera pink, I will add it there. If I want a bit of the Rose Madder Lake, I will add it there. And the same with the Quinacridone Red mix. So we'll just play around with all of the mixes. I want quite a bright pink on this section right here, and I just start layering, and you'll see me dab the brush on the paper. That will create a lot of texture, and that's what we want. There's going to be quite a lot of texture on this flower, as well same as the Phalaenopsis orchid. It's not a smooth flower. I don't think there are many flowers that have smooth petals. They all have quite a lot of detail, quite a lot of texture, and so many colors in one single petal. And just take it everywhere over the Quinacridone Red. So you want to make sure that the paint is completely dry now, and your paper, obviously your paper, because the paint wets the paper, so you want to make sure it's all completely dry before you add the next layer, because you don't want to lift up the layer at the bottom. We want that bottom layer to shine through the top layer, because we use mostly transparent watercolors on the paintings that we normally paint. Sometimes it will be semi-opaque or opaque, but most of the time we use transparent watercolors. And you'll see me move around often, because some sections I want a lot of this bright pink color, and I just want to close that blind slightly. It's on the page, so bright. So that section's still a little bit wet, so I don't want to touch it with my hand. And I hold my brush at an angle, and then I just smooth the color all over these sections where I want this very bright opera pink mix from Daniel Smith. Skipping that little part, that white section there. Just want to put some masking fluid in there. I'll just wait for it to dry completely. That is the dotting tool that I spoke about. A lovely little tool that you can use for your masking fluid. That's much easier to use than a brush. You won't ruin your brushes either. So just put this everywhere where you see this bright pink opera pink color. And as I paint, I will adjust the colors. And already I follow the shape of this petal. So you'll notice there, some of them are a little bit at an angle, some of them facing different ways. I need to close this blind because it's really so bright. But there's a little gap on the side there, so I can't really close it. And it's right in the middle of my painting. I'll just add this color everywhere where I see this bright color. And hopefully by then the light would change. Okay, so finally I found a way to close it with some clips, and it's no longer shining on the paper. So this is the Rose Madder Lake. I'm going to mix some of it on my palette now. Just activate it because it dried out a little bit, and I want to drop in a darker section right here near the center of the flower. Still follow the shape of the petals, and then I want to harden some of those lines that's on the edges of each petal. Make sure you have your tissue paper handy so that you can wipe your brush on your tissue paper. And that's the section that I want to harden, where the petals sort of connect to the center. So I won't soften those little sections there. I want quite a hard line there. It's like a tiny little gap between each petal. And then I just rinse my brush and soften those markings. And you'll notice that the paint just soaks into the paper and immediately stain these little sections. So try and go back as soon as you can with your brush as soon as you drop in the pigment. I try to go back as quickly as possible so it doesn't cause any hard lines, but sometimes it stains the paper too quickly for me to get back to it. But then I just go back later and I'll soften it with some more of my pigment. I have a little bit of pigment on my palette there because I can go back later and just add some more. Go around the stem here. And around that section there's a little gap next to that petal there, and then a stem. So just smooth little lines. Quite a smooth section here. So I just watered it down slightly to make that little gap a little bit smaller. Some more of the Rose Madder Lake right next to that edge there. So it's quite dark in the center, and then I just soften my brush. Soften the watercolor markings with my brush. Leave that little section as light as possible there, and move the color up. You can use a bigger brush if you prefer. I just have to see exactly where I'm painting. Again, I use this as a puzzle for me, so I go in section by section, so I look at the painting. That's the way I get to paint these very technical little flowers, and it might not look technical, but there's quite a lot of things happening on this little hibiscus flower. Quite a lot of folds, quite a lot of holes, and some darker sections and some lighter sections. So I want to map it all in. Again, around this section, and I just wet my brush and I soften and smooth it out. For me, it's just easier to use a small brush so that I can add all the detail correctly, because I don't want to go back later and just make it hard for myself by adding in all of the color, and then I have to go back later and remove it all again. That way I don't like doing that, because I will have to remove and then it will ruin my paper. So this way is much easier for me with a small little brush. Soften those little markings, and then in between the masking fluid I want to add some of this color as well, so I just wiggle the brush around. Now at the edge, on the edge of that, or the tip of that petal at the top there, I just dab my brush with quite a nice, neat but wiggly petal. I don't want it to be straight, you want it to look like a petal. Go around that section there, and then soften those little markings with your brush. And again, more texture. The opera rose I have to hold my hand like that over the section so that I don't touch the paper. And just smooth it out nicely. Just put the names of each color that I use there for you to make it easier for you to see which colors I take at different times. For my beginner students that don't yet know all of the colors, this is one just to make it easier for everyone. Let me move it in view. If I was a beginner, I will use this as a little puzzle and just paint each section, if that makes sense. Just paint each section. If you want to paint flowers, just make sure you paint each section like a puzzle and take your time. Don't paint one solid flower because it will just confuse you and it's just too much. I find that if I do it this way, it's much easier for me to complete a full flower, and I've never stopped painting that way because I love painting flowers and I love to paint a lot of detail on my flowers. And this way I just find if I break it up in tiny little puzzles, this way I can finish the flower, and when I look at it and stand up and stand back and really look at it, it's a complete flower. But sometimes when you look, it's a little bit overwhelming. So just break it up in tiny little puzzles, and that way you'll be able to paint a full flower, so don't feel overwhelmed. I prefer to layer each petal this way so that I can go back and layer with different colors, different tonal values, a little bit more blue, a little bit more purple. Wherever I see I have to adjust the colors. This way I don't go in too dark where it's very difficult to remove some of the paint at a later stage. So this way I find it works for me. There's a little bit of a section there that I want to leave as light as possible for now. I might go back later and just darken it. And I want to leave it very watery. So this is how far we are for now. I'm going to leave that little section in there. There are quite a lot of holes on the flower, and it just makes the flower look interesting. So we're going to leave those little holes that the slugs and the hojos ate. And again, I'm just activating the colors again. So this is the Rose Meadow Lake mixed with the Opera Rose. And that's the little tube. I'm going to put all of the colors here right next to me so you can see the tubes and all of the colors that I mix on the left hand side there for you. So you can see that the colors all mix on that little plate now. I like all the colors, it's so bright. And I also picked up a little bit more of the masking fluid with the dotting tool, and I need to just mask in that little hole so that I don't paint over that. I just noticed I missed one of the little holes in the flower. Now I just have to remind myself that I dropped in that masking fluid there so I don't paint over it while it's still wet, because then my brush will just be full of this. So this is the Raphael number 1 or 2 brush, whichever, doesn't matter what size of brush that you use for this. And then I have a colored glass for the dirty water, and then a clean glass for my clean water. That way I won't mix it up, because you always want clean water so you don't muddy your watercolors, especially if you use different colors. Now for instance like a green or for instance your blue, you want to keep your colors all clean, so you do want to rinse your brush in between each section in clean water, including rinsing it first in the dirty water and then in the clean water, just to keep your water very nice and clean. So this little section's got a bit of orange in, like a more, I would say, the quinacridone red mix. It's a bit brighter, so a little bit red or yellow. You can actually use a bit of a more yellow in that mix, but I'm just going to stick with this. I thought, let me just lay it in first and then see how it turns out, and then I will go back in later with maybe a little bit more yellow if I need to. So that little section is dry now completely. I'm going to paint in that same color on the top there. I want to keep it neat because the petal is there. It ends right there. So I do want to have different tonal values between each of the petals. So I also want to keep those lines very nice and neat. So that is the reference photo. I'm going to add it for you down below so that you have it ready and you can see it. And this is how far we are right now. As you can see, lots of texture, lot of detail. It looks beautiful. It's not finished yet. I think this is the ugly stage that we're at now. So we are going to start with all of the next layers right now. And you have to make sure again that your painting is completely dry. So I just zoomed it in slightly so that we can have a little bit of a close-up. Again, the Raphael brush that I'm going to use, I want to keep the brushes limited as possible so that I don't mix so much with a few different ones. Like sometimes when I paint something for myself, I will use a whole bunch of different brushes. But for this, I wanted to keep it very simple so that you can use what you have and what, well, you know, you don't have to mix and match between all of the brushes. So I want to keep it very simple by using just a few brushes, 3 or 4 a maximum. So again, I want to drop in a little bit of a darker section there, and I'm just using the color on my palette, so make sure that this is now thicker. I want a thicker consistency because there's a lot less water on my brush, so that I can paint in that shadowy section. So again, like I said before, you want to push something back so that the other petal next to it stands out. You will darken the petal at the back. I just noticed this section I painted in a very dark line there, so I'll have to remove that because it's actually part of a petal. And I'm not sure why I painted in that section. When I really looked closely with my glasses on, I noticed that it's part of a petal. So I'm just going to paint that in right now. And I might have to use my scrubber brush just to move that little line that I painted in there now. But it's not a train smash. We can always just paint a little harder line section over there. But yes, I'm going to use the scrubber brush softly. Don't want to ruin the paper. This is very strong paper, so just make sure when you use a scrubber brush that your paper is very strong. And then I'm just going to drop it in over that section. I'm going to wet this and just smooth out those lines. Pick up some of the color again. This is a little bit more watery now. I want to just darken in around that little section there. And I want to soften that line there because I need a bigger. So just use your scrubbing brush and soften it. A little bit too much pigment went in there, but what's nice is you can just go back and remove it with your paint. Soften it, and then I'm going to wet it and just drop in some color. I don't want a hard line there. We will paint in hard lines at a later stage around each one of these little masking fluid sections that we have because we want it to stand out, but I don't want to paint it in yet. So again, I just use my brush and I scrub over all of those little markings that I painted in earlier to try and soften them a little bit. We will add loads of layers at a later stage so they will soften. And all we're going to do now is just layer and layer even more color. So you'll see that I pick up slight bit of clean water, and then I just dip my brush in some of the opera pink or the rose madder and very watery mixes that I will be dropping in on certain parts where I see there needs a bit more of that color or a little bit of that color, and then I just go right against the masking fluid section there so I make sure that I can get some of the color in there, because we will darken it all a lot later so it stands out as you saw on the reference photo. Now that section, there's a lot of detail there, so much that most of the detail is actually on that section there. So we will focus on that right now. And then I noticed there's a little hole that I didn't paint in that I need to just draw in at this stage, so that while the paint is still, the pigment is very light, and that's why we paint with layers and layers like this, so that I can go back later and just, maybe if I made a mistake or I forgot to paint in something, I can do it right now. So I don't think I'm going to put masking fluid in now. I'm just going to paint around that section with my brush, and then I will just soften those little lines. I'm going to keep it light for now, but a little bit darker than all the previous layers. So I just use my brush and I just wiggle it around. We want a lot of texture on this petal. And this pigment just soaks up into the paper so quickly, so I'm very careful not to create hard lines. So I try and go back quickly and just soften it immediately. And then around the petal here, the edge of the petal, to see if that's in view. And then I just drop in some more pigment while it's wet. Certain sections are dry, so the paper is completely dry, and that little section that I just painted was a little bit wet, so it's much easier for the pigment to flow. But I do want a lot of texture on these petals, that's why I preferably paint on the dry paper. If my paper is wet, it will flow everywhere and just create a soft, smooth layer of watercolor over that petal. But we want to create all of those little textures, different colors, and I want all of that to shine through, so that's why I'm going in with this layer by layer on the darker paper. Now around this section there's a bit of a blue purple mix, so I just picked up some of my violet that I had on my palette and I just dropped it in there. Where certain parts on the petal, the slugs ate certain sections, there's a little bit of a blue tinge to it, so the petal is a little bit more translucent, and for some reason there's like a little bit of a purple blue mix there, so you'll see that I might bring in some more ultramarine at a later stage, but for now we'll just use a bit of this violet. And then I'll just soften those markings again, and I scrub with my brush to soften it. And I just move the pigment around. Still want a very light translucent section here, so I just pick up some watery mixes and then just drop it in on that wet section there. And if I want to remove some paint, especially this section here, I want it a little bit lighter, just use my tissue paper to lift out some of that pigment, and then I go back and just soften those lines again and wet this section with clean water. Just move that around to smooth it out a bit more. So quinacridone red, I want to darken this little section on this part here. So small little sections that I'm painting in. This is the mix that has a bit more of the orangey, so it's a bit of a warmer pink, I would say, compared to the others that I'm using. Looks like there's a bit of yellow in. In fact, you can use some opera rose with a bit of yellow in if you don't have the quinacridone red. I think that will be quite a beautiful mix as well. I've used that before on some of my rose paintings. Beautiful peachy pink that it creates. And then I just darken those shadowy sections there on the petal. Slowly with the tip of my brush. I'm trying to create those little markings that I can see there. It's quite a cold morning, so very cold. Mr. T is snoring here next to me. funny, chihuahuas always shiver in the cold weather, even when it's summer. And again on this section, I want to darken it again with the quinacridone red mix. I want to keep those little markings very light, so I just smooth it out immediately with water so that I don't have to scrub on that section again with my scrubber brush. We don't want to go back and scrub again and ruin the paper, because every time you scrub you sort of disturb the little fibers of the paper, and I'm quite happy with that. And this is how far we are now with this beautiful hibiscus. I'm going to mix some more colors. I'm going to use a different little plate with a French ultramarine from Winsor & Newton, just to keep it separate from our pink mix on the plate, otherwise it will turn this beautiful purple mix and we don't want that. So I'm just going to mix a drop of that, and I want to paint that in certain sections, so you don't need a lot of it. So don't use too much on, don't squeeze too much out if you use a tube. On this section I just want to drop some of the blue in, and it's very, very watery. And then on this section here, like I said before, there's quite a lot happening on this petal. I'm going to use a much thicker piece, not a thicker piece, I'm going to use a thicker consistency of paint now on these sections, and I'm not going to soften them immediately. We want all of those little folds and lines to show this hibiscus has numerous veins and folds in it. Is so beautiful. So there's a lot of detail on this hibiscus, so I'm going to paint it all in, not all of it, but I'm going to paint most of it in. And I'm not going to follow the line drawing exactly, because I didn't paint in all of the little markings, just some of it, and then I just follow the reference photo, and I'm going to paint in whatever I see wherever I want to, and you can do the same. So if you want to leave this out, you don't have to paint in all of the markings, you can just leave it plain and just carry on painting the lace that we painted earlier, and just add a few little markings, or you can just if you prefer, you can paint in all of the markings. So it's up to you, whatever you want to paint in. And you can see the color is a lot thicker and a lot less water on my brush, and on this section too. And then I just go back and squeeze my brush down on the paper, so I just push it flat to create thicker sections on the painting, and darken these parts here, and each one will eventually look like a little fold, and a lot of detail on the petal if you stand back. So for now it looks very weird, the whole painting looks like it's just weird, but it will all come together at a later stage. I love painting in all of the detail, and by doing this it creates quite a lot of texture on the painting. Again, you can use whatever you want, and you will notice that the color, again, there's not a lot of water on my palette there, so if you have a lot of water it will be very watery, but we want to add all of the detail now, and then when you add a lot of detail your paint should be a little bit drier. Now these little sections take quite a lot of time, and it's fun. So again, you know, if you need to take a break, just take a break and come back at a later stage and add it in. This is the fun part for me, to add all of the texture and detail in. So I just take a break often, have a cup of tea, or just quickly go and walk in the garden. And then I will soften certain sections if I notice I need to soften it a little bit with my brush. So just clean water, make sure your water is clean here. And I'm trying to create all of those little folds that I can see on the petals. So just go over each layer again. If you think you need to darken it, you will see that I will go back and forth quite a lot throughout the next part of the tutorial, where I will darken certain sections and I will just layer again with some more watery mixes of watercolor. and to create the beautiful little detail on these petals. So there's quite a lot of back and forth where I notice, okay, maybe that section needs a little bit darkening, maybe that section needs a little bit darkening, and that is part of the watercolor, the style of painting that we're going to paint for this hibiscus. Certain hibiscus flowers don't have any folds and little veins and whatever, and well, until I find one, I'll take a photo and we can paint one of those one day. But this one has quite a lot of detail. Again, if you don't want to paint in the detail, don't paint it in. It's up to you. It's whatever you want to paint. When I pause like this, it's just because I look at the reference photo and I go back and look where I have to add a little bit more detail. So there's, like I said, quite a lot happening here. So you'll notice that I pause a lot and then just look at the reference photo and then come back and add a bit more detail. So I want to, all of these little markings that we paint will make such a difference to the flower. So I'm trying to get them as close to what I can see as possible. And that is where the masking fluid is, so there's a little hole there. I'm just trying to create those little markings in there. So make sure your brush is not too wet. I notice this is part of the flower that I didn't paint in, because you know there's also a little bit of a leaf there. So I'm just going to go back and just make it a little bit more bigger. I can still do that. Luckily the layers were very light. So just go over that section and drop in some more color. And this section has a lot of that opera pink, bright, shocking pink color on there. So again, just quickly with a watery mix, just dropping it in. And then softening those lines at the same time while scrubbing on the paper with a soft brush. Make sure your paper that you use is quite a good quality. And then I'm just going to paint a bit more in there to soften that section there. Drop in some more color and bring it down. I'm quite happy with that section now. Just go over these little markings and at the same time softening them a little bit. So every time you go over these little markings, you soften them slightly. So we won't have hard lines. This is the part of the petal. So I just want to paint that all in now so that I don't paint over a petal and think it's a full petal there. And then I just lift out some of my tissue paper if I go into dark. Softening those little markings. And I'm going to leave that to dry for now. The hibiscus is quite a long tutorial as well. I think in total it was about 2 hours, just the flower. That's without the leaf. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it into parts just to make it easier for me to upload, especially with load shedding at the moment and our data, so that you can watch each section in your own time. So I will break this up in 2 parts, and then the leaves will be painted separately, which will be another part. So I think there might be 2 or 3 parts to this tutorial, definitely more than 2, but you'll see when I upload them, and I will keep you posted on that. It's just that when there's load shedding, you can't use the data because the towers, the data towers for the cellular networks don't work. They work for about an hour, and then especially because I'm in an outlying area, and then there's no data. So I'm going to do it this way so that I can do it maybe during the night when the power comes on, so that you can at least download part 1 and then part 2 and part 3. By now it should start to look like a hibiscus. Still a little bit of a way to go for us, but already you can see that it is a hibiscus and no longer just patches like a quilt with half sections fixed, and it's all going to come together quite nicely. So it's still very ugly. It's like the ugly stage of watercolors. That's what we call it in botanical art, but it's all going to come together very soon, and then you'll see this whole flower just becomes this beautiful flower on paper that you created on watercolor paper. That was once a piece of a white sheet of paper. That's always so interesting to see, is when you start a watercolor painting and you put down your drawing that it's a white piece of paper and it looks like nothing, just flat piece of gray pencil on a paper, and then as you start painting it becomes something, some 3D object that you painted. That's always so interesting for me to see, is when I look at it that way, that you create something on paper that wasn't there before. So here in this section I'm just dropping in some of the pigment. Paper is still dry in certain sections, so just notice if I pick up some water, the water is not in view, then you pick up some water, and then sometimes I just pick up some of the pigment that is on my plate, and then I just put that down on the paper. Still want this to be translucent and transparent layers, so just take your time and enjoy the process. This is not a rush. Our tutorials are very long. That's why we create maybe one tutorial with a few parts, where other tutorials are quite quicker, the shorter mini tutorials, but these ones are quite long, but they're fun. So again, I want to just keep this very smooth on this part. There's quite a few little veins that I drew in, but we'll paint them in later. I do want it to stand up from the white paper. I might not paint in all of the leaves, but let's see how we get on with this painting. We'll definitely paint one. And then I just soften those little markings with some clean water. And this is how far we are. This is reference number 4. I will also add it for you to download. Now we're going to paint in this section. I have a bit more of the masking fluid there. I'm going to leave it for now. I'll just add in the detail a little bit later. Again, back to this section here. Layering, softening, going over it with some of your pigment. I like to paint this way. I suppose you can paint it much quicker and just drop in the color very quickly, but I like to see the process come together this way, by adding the layers like this. You take your time and you paint in each section where you think you need to darken or lighten, like I do right here, and then I want to leave a lighter little section right there. And then again you just smooth out all of the pigment that we painted on earlier, but you can see that all of those little markings still shine through each layer that we're painting and adding in right now. So I just use the tip of my brush to drop it in, and I sort of push it flat to soften the markings, and then when I want to add detail I just use the tip of my brush. So it's very important to always look at how we hold our brushes so that we can create all of those little markings. And then I just darken the section again as well with the mix with the Rose Madder Lake and the Opera Rose. And I'm going to leave that section to dry now, but I do want to add in some of that quinacridone red mix on this petal here. So again I pause and I look at my reference photo, trying to get as close to the detail that I can see, and I use the tip of my brush to create that section there so that I can add in the detail. I don't want to paint into a section where I'm not supposed to, and then I just use my brush to scrub a little bit and to move the paint around to get a smooth section in there, and push it back with my brush like I do right there. So I use my brush to move the pigment and paint that in there, soften that with my brush. I just scrub it with a tip. bit more, and I'm going to drop in some more color there. Again, I want to make sure that there's a difference between those two petals. To there, that section there. And that part is dry now. This section's still a bit wet. I'm going to start here at the top and take some of the markings down so some of the little detail that I can see on these petals. Just with a watery mix, so make sure your pigment's very watery, but a little bit thicker than the other layers that we painted in earlier. Little lines with your brush. Make sure your brush has a nice tip. This brush has quite a nice tip. Very, very light, because I can always go back later and darken it. More detail. You can turn the page around if you feel you can manage it a bit better. I might do it at a later stage. I just have to make sure my hand is not in the way. More markings. So just make sure your paper is very dry, yeah, when you add in all of these little markings. And then just smooth that section out. Soften it. And notice the pigment on my plate. So we're just adding in a little bit more of the detail. And I want to make sure that I just build the layers slowly, like I mentioned before. So you'll notice that the color is still very thick on my palette, but a little bit watery, especially these sections where I now want to darken near the center of the flower, where it folds in. So I want to smooth that out a little bit. And I just use my brush to soften those little markings again. And then push it back so it's not too dark. Again, I want to leave that lighter section there. And again, we wet this section, clean water. And this is how far we are. This is watercolor photo reference number 5. So I just want to feel if this is now dry. That section is still a bit wet, so I'm going to focus on this part. Just drop in some more color. This is now a little bit thicker, so we want to start building up on the thicker consistency, where we're going to start adding all of the thick detail, or the final parts of the flower. So you'll notice the consistency is much thicker. And then I just take my brush and dab little sections in there, in between all of the masking fluid parts that I've dropped in there. So just use the tip of your brush and then smooth it out a little bit. And I'm going to add quite a dark mix against that section there where the masking fluid is. So wiggling my brush on the paper. Lots of texture on this section here. And then I just move some of the paint back with my brush. Lift it out if I notice it's a bit dark. I want to leave that little section a little bit lighter. This is clean water, I'm just moving it around with my brush. And again, some detail around this part. And I want to leave that section quite light. So I'm going to darken around it now. That is a little bit wet, so you'll see that when I paint the pigment in, it just moves around. This side's a little bit drier now, so I'm just going to quickly pick up water and just soften it with my brush and move it around. I want to keep that soft, we don't want it to be too hard. And if you make a mistake, sometimes just picking up some water and quickly moving it around with your brush is an easy way to sort of erase certain sections depending on what type of pigment you use. If the pigment is staining, it might be a little bit more difficult to remove. So just soften it with the tip of my brush there. And this is how far we are. I'm going to wait for that part to dry now, so we're going to focus on this section. Now again, there's some masking fluid in there. Again, I want it to be standing. I want it to stand out, so I'm going to darken right around that masking fluid section, and that would stand out. So the white part will show off really white on that section, and the darker sections will just make sure that that white will really stand out. If that makes sense, we want it to be quite dark around these little sections that we're painting in. So those masking fluid sections, we want to really darken around them, but still keep the lines of the sections very soft away from that white masking fluid part. Sometimes the masking fluid leaves quite a harsh line, so we will soften it a little bit later. Again, on the section, just a bit more of that color. And I'm going to finish up now, just adding the last little bit of detail, and then I'm going to come back with part 2, just dropping in some of that Rose Madder Lake on this section and move it around with my brush. I want quite a dark section there, and then just push it back into that top part near the petal. Still painting some of the markings in that I can see, although that will shine through at a later stage. And then I just use some of the pigment to soften some of those little markings again. And smooth it out, and as you can see already, it looks so much better. So here we are, and just a little bit of a close-up of what I'm adding in and how I'm adding in those detail around the flower. This is sped up, and this is what you want to do with your brush, just from a different angle, so that you can see exactly how I hold my brush and what I do on the paper by creating all of those little textures and detail. And I'm going to come back with part 2. Go and stretch your legs, have a cup of tea, and come back for the next part. See you now.